So welcome to today's webinar, and we're going to be speaking about guiding grief. And my name is Farah, and I am a clinical social worker from the US, and I specialize in working with grief, trauma, and workplace mental health. And I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes today, and then towards the end of today's webinar, we'll leave some time for question and answers. So a little bit about who we are. We're the largest outpatient mental health clinic in the Gulf region. So we're a team of about 30 psychologists and 3 psychiatrists. And we work with individuals all across the lifespan. And we work really closely with corporate organizations, hospitals, schools, government to support their well-being initiatives. That's us in a nutshell. So today we're going to be talking about what is grief. What are some myths about grief and loss? What are some of the impacts of secondary losses, particularly during this time of COVID? How grief shows up in us, emotionally, physically, spiritually, in our community, and how do you move through grief in a healthy way? And I'll also speak to you throughout today's webinar about how to support other people in your teams or in your lives who may be experiencing loss. Oops, okay. So I want us to be mindful that typically when we think about grief, we link it to losing someone to death. And while that is absolutely a type of loss, there are also so many significant secondary losses that we're experiencing in our life right now. There is a loss of a sense of safety. Safety in being able to go to the store without being worried about someone coming near you. There's a loss of so many different personal small businesses that we used to go to. So many things have closed. There's been a loss of a normal summer, being able to travel, being able to see family. There is a loss of economic security. So even I find that so many individuals where they feel safe in their job, there can be a sense of anxiety around, but look at what's happening around us. I feel a bit guilty for having a job. There's a sense of loss of what is happening around us, right? A sense of freedom, being able to travel in and out of Abu Dhabi and different countries. And this is almost if we're thinking about, there's physical loss and there's grief linked to that, but then we talk about the secondary loss, and these are the kind of seismic ripples that loss can have in our life. And we're going to take a deeper look at what that actually looks like. So when we think about what grief is, it's very different from mourning. Okay, so mourning is cultural or religious. It's linked to certain practices. So for example, mourning is 3 days of prayer Islamically, or 40 days of grief that may be permitted. It's a period of time that begins and it ends. It may be wearing black. Grief is the internal experience of loss, and it has no endpoint. It's the thoughts, emotions, feelings linked to longing for someone that used to be in your life. The most defining feature of grief is that it comes in waves. I always describe it like having your back to the ocean and never knowing when the waves will come, and never knowing the size of what those waves may actually be. So it's very common that if you or someone in your life is grieving, right, that they can say, I feel like I'm losing control, where one minute I can feel okay, and the next minute I feel quite sad or angry or anxious. I need you to know that that's a very normal thing to be feeling. And typically, sometimes the waves can be unpredictable, but sometimes they can be linked to specific things, like when you're approaching a death anniversary or a birthday or Christmas is approaching. Certain things can be triggers, but can also be smells, wanting to send that person a message. You know, when we even think of the grief linked to trauma and the loss, so when we think of like for example, the Beirut explosion and the loss of a sense of safety or home, right? That next time this year, we can imagine there can be that residual grief of, I cannot believe it's been a year since this happened. So there can be certain triggers we can anticipate, but it can all, a wave of grief can be triggered by no specific reason. It's hard to find a sense of order in grief. Okay, so I want you to know this is not something that ends. Grief stays with you as long as you live. And usually when I say that to people, they get upset with me. And they say, well, am I going to feel this way forever? Is it going to feel this overwhelming or upsetting? And I will say that when grief is acute and it's fresh, that usually those few months, it's like a big open wound. And during that time, it never feels quite like that. It softens from those initial days and weeks. But then the pain begins to look quite different. Okay, so let's take a closer look at that. And I really love this quote. I had my own notion of grief. I thought it was a sad time that followed the death of someone you loved, and you had to push through it to get to the other side. But I'm learning there is no other side. There is no pushing through, but rather there is absorption, adjustment, or acceptance. And grief is not something you complete, but rather you endure. It is not a task to finish and move on, but an element of yourself, an alteration of your being, and a new way of seeing, a new definition of self. And I'll say that as a grief counselor, I wish I could banish this word of acceptance, because the word acceptance supports the idea that grief is a linear healing process, that there may be some day, month, or year that arrives that you've accepted your loss. And I would say, I would really like to change the word of acceptance to adjustment. You will learn how to live with your loss, and people learn how to live with it. But acceptance, it doesn't accurately describe the healing process, right? So you can have moments of acceptance or feeling like, I understand that I'm no longer living without this person. And the next hour or the next day, you can have moments of disbelief, of, I cannot believe that they are not here for this moment or for this day. And I'll always have people say that, am I doing this wrong? Am I healing incorrectly? Am I crazy? And I want you to know that that's a very normal reaction to have with grief. And if you have people on your team who are grieving, I want you to be very mindful that they may have periods of times where they are super functional and they're doing okay, and another moment of tearfulness or feeling very stuck. And that is a very normal thing to be experiencing. Now, as we look closer at common grief reactions, I want you to know that each person's grief and how they grieve will be as unique as their fingerprint. There's really no right or wrong way to be grieving. You may find that some people want to speak about it, and you may find other people who completely shut down and they don't feel comfortable speaking about it. Some people may find comfort in looking at pictures, and some people may not. There's really no right or wrong way. And I'll often find that some people will become extremely functional. They'll focus on the paperwork and the tasks and what needs to happen and what needs to be done. Those individuals will usually be painted as the strong ones, but really the strong ones are just functional. And functionality does not mean I'm okay, because someone can be functioning really high, but also really be struggling with how they're feeling. Those individuals will typically have more of a delayed reaction to their grief. Okay? So emotionally, and remember, grief is not just a sad time, and it's not only the emotion of sadness. So you can imagine that grief is really any emotion you can imagine. There can be a sense of shock, denial, numbness, or disbelief, confusion, agitation, anger, feeling very irritable, overwhelmed. You can imagine that experiencing a loss is like when the wound is fresh, it's like a fracturing of yourself. I've had someone say to me that, especially in those early weeks of their loss, that it felt like their center of gravity had been destroyed, you know, not knowing what is up, down, left, right. And you can imagine that it can almost feel like life is a bit of a dreamlike state. Now, some of the intensity of those emotions will soften over time, but as you're moving forward, any of these emotions can be wrapped in those waves that come very unpredictably. Okay, so there can be a feeling of disappointment, sadness, tearfulness. If there was a loved one who was ill for quite some time, there may be a sense of relief. There may be guilt for feeling that. And if you know someone who's been sick for quite some time, you can experience anticipatory grief, that even before the loss occurs, you can see waves of these unpredictable emotions. There may be anxiety and fear. You know, most of us move through our life with a bit of an invincible bubble around us. We feel quite safe, you know, even when we're reading the news and different things are happening. And when grief occurs, when that happens in your life, it's almost like there's a shattering of this bubble around you, and you can feel quite anxious and less safe in your life. You can see wrapped in the grief can be worry. What if I lose someone else? What if something happens to me? And that's a very common grief reaction to have. Okay. How they can present in our behavior. And I'll say that it's one of the most common things I hear after grief occurs is, I can't relate to people in the same way that I used to. That people around me are speaking about work or projects or even things that related to COVID. And you're thinking, I'm finding it really hard to relate to this because my entire world has been disrupted. Yeah. So I need you to know that that's very normal, and that, you know, when we speak about those, there's the person that you've lost, right? But then there's the secondary losses that occur. And for many people, they can be grieving who they were before the loss took place. Now, behaviorally, you may see trouble falling asleep, waking up too early, really disrupted sleep. And that will be very pervasive in you know, when grief is fresh. You should see a softening of that as time moves forward. You may see changes in weight, feeling really exhausted. Grief does impact us neurologically. So it is physical, emotional, spiritual. There can be a fogginess. You can also see a clumsiness, right? Like being quite disoriented, things feeling quite dreamlike. You may notice that there's a withdrawing from others, feeling less interested in the world. There may be nightmares. Some people may want to avoid reminders of the loss, and other people may find comfort in clothes and scents and being near memories. Okay? There may be crying, and there can be a lot of what if scenarios wrapped in that anxiety. What if this happened? What if that happened? Should I have done something differently? Okay, so there can be a lot of that anxiety. And I'm seeing some hands going up. We're going to have you know, quite a bit of time at the end where you can, in the Q&A section, leave your question. I'll make sure that we answer that. So grief is very physical. So it's interesting. So the body keeps score, right? So it is you know, on a neurological, cellular level, your body is changing. In one of our grief support groups last night, I've been working with an individual. She lost her husband 3 years ago, and she's extremely high performing and often feels guilty for saying, well, everyone looks at me and says I'm so strong. Like, I'm back at work, I'm doing really well, but I don't feel well. And in the last few weeks, she started having kidney stones. And her physician said to her, what happened 3 years ago? Right? Because it seems like around that time, these stones started forming. And that was actually the time in her life where her husband had died, right? So even though she wasn't always conscious, she's not always consciously connecting with her grief, but it is still within your body that you are carrying it, right? So physical symptoms, so remember those waves that come. It's not always cognitive waves or emotions. It can be a wave of feeling exhausted, tired, a heaviness or emptiness in your kind of stomach and in your heart. You may notice an oversensitivity to noise and kind of sensory things around you. There can be a dreamlike state, feeling like things are not real, or just feeling like, is this a movie? How did this happen? Is this real life? You may notice muscle weakness, a lack of energy, or dry mouth. And these are just some of the common ones. Of course, this is not a kind of covers everything, because for each person, it may manifest in your body a little bit differently. So there will be spiritual impacts to grief as well. So there can be a feeling of purposelessness, of beginning to question everything, right? So imagine there's this seismic event that takes place. It's almost like a loss of the individual, but a shattering of the sense of self, where now you're saying, what is the point of things? What happens when we're not here anymore? Where is this person? Can I still communicate with them? What does this mean? All of these questions kind of bubble forth, right? Really quickly, and during a time when you're already feeling injured. I don't have the answers to these questions, and I don't know that one person does, but I need you to know that to ask these questions and to sit with them, or to ask why, is a part of the grieving journey. And some people may find great comfort in faith or spirituality, and other people may feel betrayed or angry and turn away. And there's really no wrong or right, but it's important that you allow yourself to be on this journey with a lot of compassion, okay? And I will say that one of the reasons why at the Lighthouse especially, we are so passionate about our grief center is what we find in the region is that there can be so much shame around experiencing grief and thinking, why do I still feel this way? Why do I still feel so upset and hurt and devastated years on? Am I questioning my faith? Are my beliefs not strong? And it creates a lot of shame. But what we know is that it's actually healthy to allow yourself to express that, and very normal to be feeling that as time moves forward. So I'd like to speak to you now about some very pervasive, harmful myths related to grief. And I'll just say that as we're going through this and you're learning this, please be compassionate to yourself, because it's only when we know better that we can do better towards ourselves, towards the people we love in our lives, and also in your organizations. So it's a myth that the pain will go away faster if you ignore it. That is simply not true. Imagine if you're, imagine if you had a sprained ankle and you said, well, if I just keep walking on it and ignoring it, it will go away. You're actually risking it worsening. And so imagine when you think about grief or really difficult emotions, imagine them like in a teapot where the steam and pressure is rising, rising, rising. You must have a mechanism to release that pressure. Right? When we do not find ways of releasing, and that release can be talking about it, journaling, running, walking, expression of some sort. When we ignore it, it will manifest as a higher risk for developing depression, anxiety, addiction, or physical health issues. Okay? So another myth is that it's important to be strong in the face of loss. As you are grieving, you really do not have to be You do not have to do or be anything extra to be strong. Simply surviving through it and allowing yourself to feel the emotions we typically paint as weak, like crying or anxiety or fear, that does not mean that you're not being strong, right? To express emotion actually takes a lot of courage. And I think that when we live in quite an emotion-phobic culture. So you can imagine that for many people, even before the loss took place, there's an averse reaction to emotions. And then here comes this massive, catastrophic life event of losing someone in your life. and it's a surge of emotions. So it can put a huge strain on a system if you haven't been more attuned to your emotions, as many of us have not, because most of us have not grown up in homes where there was more emotional attunement or really permission to feel your emotions. Another myth is that if you are not crying, then you are not grieving. That is not true. You can be very functional and very wounded, but not be crying. And I'll often have people say to me, well, why can't I cry? Does it mean that I'm not okay? Or does it mean that I didn't love this person? And that's just not true, okay? And I find that men will get this a lot, and some women, which they'll say is, I'm not crying. Does that mean I'm okay? That's just not true, okay? Grief should only last a certain amount of time and then you get over it. That's not true, okay? You learn how to live with that loss, but it is never finished and completed and now I'm okay. There can be this real fantasy of resolution that it will go away and it'll be done. Okay, but we know that you can be grieving 10 years on, 15 years on. You never forget. Another myth is that as you move forward with your life and you adjust to your loss, that it means you're forgetting. And that's simply not true. Okay, I know for many people there can be a lot of guilt, like I smiled or I had a day where I forgot what happened, right? Some other myths that once you are done grieving, that your life will return to normal. And really after grief has taken place, it's more about adjusting to the new normal of what it's like to live without this person and also what you're like after experiencing a loss. Another myth is that time heals all wounds. That's not true. It really depends on what you do with that wound. Imagine if a physical health physician said to you, you have an infection on your arm and, eventually time will just heal it. It's not true for mental health as well. It really depends on how you respond to that injury, how you're taking care of yourself. Are you being compassionate? Are you shaming yourself? So time does not heal all wounds. It depends on what you do with it, okay? If you are still talking about your loved one or feeling sad after 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, it means you're stuck. That is a myth. That is not true, because as I've been saying today, it will come in these waves, and we know that that's very normal. And I'll say that no matter how many times I say this, even to people I've been working with for years, in relation to their grief, they'll, come back around a death anniversary, or perhaps there's a joyous occasion in their life or a devastating one, and they're feeling that huge tidal wave of grief, and they'll say to me, I thought I went through this. I thought I was doing this in a healthy way. And I'll always say, and in a patient way, is that is the nature of grief. It's not you. Yeah. And it's so important in your organizations to also understand that if someone wants to speak about someone, or if a wave arrives of sadness or wanting to speak about that loved one, it doesn't mean that they're stuck or something's wrong with them. That is actually a healthy expression of grief. But we live in a world where there's an enormous amount of death anxiety. So people do not feel comfortable speaking about loss. Almost getting close to it can make you feel uncomfortable. And so we tend to shy away, avoid, or distance ourselves from people who are grieving. Okay. Another myth is that you can only grieve a death. That's not true. So just as I was saying in the beginning, grief can be linked to the loss of a dream, right? So you can imagine there can be grief around, for example, when you think about infidelity, right? So there's also an enormous grief process. I cannot believe this has happened to me. Never in my dream or picture of a relationship or marriage did I imagine that this would happen. The same is true when there's sickness or something traumatic or difficult happens in your life. Getting fired, all of these things, there can be a massive amount of grief and loss linked to different situations. Yeah, and so even that secondary grief, it will present in this way where there is these waves and it kind of ebbs and flows throughout your life. Okay. And another huge myth is that men don't want to talk about their grief. That's just not true. That's just not true. Men grieve and feel as equally as women do, but there's a tremendous amount of stigma around men expressing emotions. And there's a really great book I've been reading. It's called Permission to Feel, and I highly recommend it. So I'm going to talk to you about how to support others. I'm just going to skip over this really quickly. So when we're thinking about grief, I want you to know that there are no set stages, okay? So there's really going to be what we call these 4 tasks, but these tasks, you never complete them. You're typically going to ebb and flow through them. And the first task is to, and I'm gonna I'm gonna build my own model and do my own research. I wish it would said to adjust to the reality of loss, okay? And now remember, you can have moments and days where there's been adjustment, and you can have other months or weeks where you feel a sense of disbelief or shock. That's very normal, so be very up and down. The second task, I would argue, is one of the most important tasks, which is in order to carry your grief in a healthy way, you must give yourself permission to feel all of those emotions, right? So that means, people will say to me, well, should I keep is it okay if I distract myself, right? Like I'm working and I'm doing this. There's really no one size fits all. Some people may find comfort in work and some may be too exasperated, but it is important that you must have a conscious mechanism in your life to allow yourself to sit with the emotions that are there, right? To release them like the teapot. Because if you don't, it can have adverse effects. So it can be really helpful to even set a time in the day or in the week where you check in and you say, where did my grief show up today? Or this week, what did it look like? And I will say that while it can be great to have that kind of scheduled in time, grief is very messy. It will show up in very unexpected ways. The third task is to adjust to the reality of this new normal. What does it mean to not message this person, speak to them, call them, see them? And again, that also takes, that's not something that finishes, right? The intensity can soften over time, but it will come in those unexpected waves. Another very normal longing in grief is to feel connected to your loved one. So that may be wanting to do something in honor of them, to wear something of theirs, to cook something the way that they did. There's a longing to feel closer. I had someone say to me once her mother had died and she said, I sleep with her scarf every night. And, my husband is like, what are you doing? I don't think that's healthy. And I'll say that it's very normal to long to feel closer, right? It's so important that as you understand how to grieve in a healthy way, this is not about resolution or fixing, right? It's about making sure that you're carrying it in a healthy way, okay? It can be really helpful for many people to have different rituals. So that means, and I say this carefully because remember, no one size fits all, right? But that I'll have people say to me, well, should we celebrate Christmas or should we celebrate Eid, or, should I do the things that my loved one did in that particular way? And some years you may say, yes, I want to cook the way she did, or I want to do that in that certain way. For organizations, it can be, memorials on certain days. So I would highly encourage organizations, like next time this year to mark the Beirut explosion and to say, we will light a candle or we will have a moment of silence. That these rituals can be quite grounding for individuals. And it also lets people know that you remembered, right? We tend to walk around the world and we think that if I go to a colleague or I go to a friend and say, how are you doing? I know that your loved one died last year or 6 months ago. We think that we will remind them of their pain. But I need you to know that you're not reminding them or evoking that. They are living with that. you're actually reminding them that you remembered, that they lived. And I'll always have people who are bereaved say to me, no one says their name anymore. It's like no one says what happened. And it's so important that it's okay to say their name. And that can be a really helpful way of supporting others. Okay. Now, as you are moving forward in your grief, or even as you may have others around you who are grieving, there are some signs that you yourself or that team member may need some additional support. So if you notice that as time is moving forward, that how they are feeling is getting more and more disruptive to their health, their work, their relationships. Now remember, they may have moments of tearfulness. They may have those waves. But if you notice that those waves are getting more and more disruptive and more intense, then that is definitely a sign that they may need additional support. If you notice that they are having panic attacks or suicidal thoughts, that is a big red flag. Even if there's no grief, if you're noticing those, panic attacks or suicidal thoughts, that's definitely a red flag that someone may be experiencing a mental health crisis. So you want to get them connected to the right help. If they feel a sense of guilt or shame or responsibility, or even if they're, an obvious one is if they say to you, I'm really struggling, like, this is really hard, or I feel very lonely, which are common reactions. If you notice that they're using more and more drugs or alcohol to cope, to get through the day, or if they have a history of depression and anxiety disorders, these can be really good indicators that you may want to approach that person and encourage them to check in with their GP, to speak to a counselor. And something that we have at the Lighthouse is the Grief Center. I think that's coming up next. One of the things we do at the Grief Center is if someone has died, and you call the Lighthouse and say, my spouse has died or my colleague has died, we offer one free grief consultation. And that is a 60-minute session to, speak to a grief expert, talk about your loss, understand what is grief, what it's not, how to grieve in a healthy way. And that session is also a gateway into our free of charge grief support groups that we run throughout the year. So we're going to take a closer look at some specific things on what you can do to support others who are grieving in your personal life or on your teams as well. And I want you to know that when you're supporting people who are grieving, that I want you to think of this Maya Angelou quote, which I love, which is, people will forget what you said. They will not forget how you made them feel. Right? So more important than what you say is how you listen. Because with grief, you are not trying to offer a fix or advice. It's more about solidarity and listening, which will typically evoke a powerful helplessness within you, because we tend to be very solution oriented. We want to fix, we want to solve. It can be really hard. And of course, if you have a tendency of rationalizing your own emotions, where you will quickly think through them, very kind of cerebral and consultant-like, that you're most likely also going to do that to others in your life as well, okay? Oh, that came up twice. Okay, so the things you do not want to do is do not be attached to fixing their feeling or solving it. It's more about being with. Do not expect them to reach out to you, especially when grief is fresh in those really first 3 to 4 months. It's important that you reach out to them, ask them how they're doing, check in with them, let them know that you're thinking of them. It's also not helpful to say things like, if you need me, let me know, I'm here for you, okay? Usually people are not going to reach out when we say that. And please be compassionate to yourself, because usually we do all of these things, right? We're like, if you need me, let me know, I'm here to help. It's actually more effective if you say, I'd like to help you with the groceries this month. I will be over on Thursday night. Is that okay? So being more specific, especially when grief is acute and fresh, is very important. And so if on your team someone has experienced a loss, it can be very helpful to offer practical logistical support, because typically that person's frontal lobe is going to be offline when there's a freshness to the loss. So you also do not want them to force them to share details of what happened, especially if it was perhaps a traumatic loss, that can further traumatize the individual. You also do not want to discourage them from crying. Right? So imagine they start crying, there's a memory, or they're sharing what happened. Most of us will, you know, if you're back in the office, you may want to hug them or like stroke their arm and say, it's okay. We'll often want to give them a tissue. And I'll say that, you know, underneath that behavior is stop crying. And that's actually not helpful. Now, so like even in my office, I will have the tissue box beside the individual, but I will not hand it to them. And if I do, I'll actually say, you know, this doesn't mean don't cry, but I can see that, you know, it may be helpful if you have a tissue. Okay, so you also don't want to limit their time to grieve or to talk about their loss or what they've experienced. It's by saying things like, you should be over it by now. Okay, and particularly when grief is fresh, you don't want to take their reactions personally, right? Because they may be quite shut down, they may not be responding, they may be quite overwhelmed or reactive. That's a very normal response when grief is acute. So the things you don't want to say: it could have been worse. You have to accept this and move on. I know just how you feel. Okay? That's not helpful even if you've experienced a loss, because the circumstances will be very different. Okay? You don't want to say things like be positive. That is toxic positivity. That's not helpful, right? And remember, there's no such thing as negative emotions, right? All emotions are neutral. Some of them are just uncomfortable to feel, but we tend to paint some as we shouldn't feel sad and we shouldn't feel angry, or we should never feel afraid, and that's just not realistic. That's not good mental health. Good mental health is about being able to experience the fullness of all of your emotions. You don't want to say things like be thankful for what you have, or you shouldn't feel that way. And remember, when we say this, be thankful for what you have, or you should be thankful, remember that gratitude creates resilience, and gratitude is a great emotion. But gratitude does not compete with suffering. You can be the most grateful person and say, I'm thankful I have these resources. I'm thankful, you know, I've had so many people say to me, I feel guilty saying this, but I'm thankful that my loved one is not alive right now to experience COVID. Now, so you can have perspective and gratitude, but you can, alongside that gratitude, can also be the acknowledgement of great suffering, okay? So you also don't want to say things like you have to be strong for your team or your children or your spouse. That's not helpful, right? Especially when that person may be struggling to just get through the day or get through the week. And remember, empathy never, ever begins with at least, right? So you're like, well, you know, at least you were together, or at least you still have another child, or, you know, even in the face of trauma, I've had so many people after the explosion, they'll say, well, at least I'm alive, or, you know, at least I wasn't injured that bad, even though they may be quite devastating. And remember, at least statements are never empathic. You're diminishing what you're experiencing or what the other person is, okay? You'll be okay, or saying things like they're in a better place if someone has died. That's not helpful. It's again trying to fix the feeling. Now, please be compassionate to yourself, because I'm mindful that everything on this page is usually what people say, right? That these are not helpful things. The things that you do want to do is offer solidarity through listening. Okay? You want to offer practical support, especially in those first 3 months when grief is acute. You want to keep up regular caring contact, even if they don't respond when it's fresh. And that doesn't mean like harassing them and like every hour, but, you know, once a day, checking in and saying, I'm thinking of you, I'm wondering how you are today. Checking in can be invaluable for people. Let them cry, say their loved one's name, and remember, you're not reminding them that they died, you're reminding them you remember that they lived, okay? And let them ask questions like why? Like, why did this happen? I don't understand. But try not to answer them. Okay? It's more about sitting with it. The things that you do want to say, I can't imagine what this is like for you. I'm here to listen if you'd like to talk. There's no right or wrong way to feel. What are you doing today or this week to take care of yourself? What has this been like for you? What has this week been like for you? Okay, I'd like to help you with, groceries or paperwork or something today. Is that okay? And ask what their loved one's name was. So these are things you want to do. And I will say that for organizations, while this is very individual, right? It is really important that organizations, not just with grief, but with trauma and really with, when we look at good mental health in the workplace, are equipping managers and leaders for how to respond with empathy, but also being proactive in having crisis response strategy and policy. So having internal conversations like, what do we do if someone in our workplace dies or if someone is experiencing a loss? What type of services do we provide? What type of resources exist? Is there a culture of support and empathy around this? Do people have the skills to be empathic, right? So that's a larger conversation I encourage you to have. And as you're looking at this, what to say, what not to say, I want you to be very mindful as, on the list of do not say those things like at least or be thankful or be positive. Please make sure you're not saying those things to yourself, because they can be just as harmful and diminishing if you're speaking to yourself that way, okay? So I've told you that we have grief consultations. You just have to call the clinic for that. That is that 60-minute session, and that session is the gateway into our grief support group. So we have grieving during COVID, motherless daughters. We have the general grief support group, which is a mix of different losses, pregnancy and infant loss, and supporting after loss to suicide. These groups run throughout the year and are free. You can register or find more out about them on our website or on our social media. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'm going to leave the last 10 minutes for question and answers. I'm hearing a lot of people saying that there's perhaps a sadness or a heaviness that is coming up in having this conversation. I want you to know that that's really understandable. So please make sure that before you or as you leave today's webinar, that you take some time to practice some self-care intentionally. How about turning to God in prayer to fix our lives after problems? So faith and prayer and meditation can be huge protective factors for many people in their lives, where it can be a source of comfort and resilience. But it's important that as you are, as that is a relationship that is important in your life, that prayer and your relationship with your faith should not mean I don't feel my feelings, right? So being able to learn how to sit with sadness, sit with anger, to say, perhaps there's a larger perspective or belief on why something tragic has happened. That can be meaningful to you, and for someone else it may not be, but it's important that you still give yourself permission to feel sad, to feel angry, to feel confused, to question why. That can be really important. Excuse me. How can we contact for counseling? So you can send an email to the clinic or give them a call, and you can go from there. We have a comment. It's been 4 years when I lost my dad while I was working overseas. And I haven't seen him and never had a chance to talk to him because he was in the ICU when we lost him. I feel guilty because I haven't gotten the chance to speak with him and when he asked for me. I don't know how to deal with it, and it's very difficult for me to move on. Well, thank you for having the courage to share that with me today. I want you to know that there's two things I want you to know, and I'll say about grief, which is guilt can be a healthy emotion, and guilt is behavior specific. So I wish I did something differently. I wish I called that person more, or I wish I traveled sooner, or guilt is specifically about a behavior. I did something I'm not happy with. Shame, on the other hand, is I am bad, right? So shame is lethal. It's like injecting poison into our bodies. And it's shame will say things like, what kind of daughter am I? How could I have done that? What's wrong with me? I'm a horrible person. Now, if you find that you're shaming yourself, that's quite lethal. And that's where it can be really helpful to check in with a grief counselor and say, yeah, let's take a closer look at what's going on here. Because, excuse me, imagine speaking to someone else that you loved who said, I couldn't be there. I feel so bad. I would like to imagine that you would never, even if it were a stranger, say to them, what's wrong with you? You should have been there for him, right? So it's really important in your grief journey that you give yourself permission to feel everything, but with a lot of compassion. And the second thing I'll say is when I hear you saying, it's very difficult for me to move on, is that rests on that myth that grief means now I move forward. Now it's done and now I go on, right? It's more about learning how to live with your loss. And that can be so hard because in some ways you begin to grieve who you were before he even died and what it means to live with the loss and the sadness of not having him in your life anymore. So we have a question, how is grief managed work in cross-cultural contexts? Thanks indeed. So when we're thinking, I think that Dubai and the UAE is the most diverse place in the world. And all of these things I've told you today are really best practice supports in how to respond to others. And you always want to be curious with people that are most likely different religions or cultures or backgrounds, being really curious about what their grief means to them. And so questions like, what has this been like for you? How are you doing this week? You want to use open-ended questions and never make assumptions of how someone may be grieving. Yeah, so we have a question about the support group. So you can find a list of all of our support groups. I think we have 17 different support groups, but 5 different grief support groups, and you can find that on our website. So I have a question. The book I recommend that's, it's not grief specific, but it's Permission to Feel. Another book that's grief specific is It's Okay Not to Be Okay. Is a very good book that I recommend. Okay, so I'm going to, I think if you have any more questions for me, you can send an email to the same email address that you registered for today's webinar for, but also I don't see there's a chat function. My email is fdahabi, so that's F as in France, DAHABI, at lighthousearabia.com. So that I'll just repeat it one more time before we end the call. It's F as in France, and then DAHABI at lighthousearabia.com. So if you have any questions or questions about services or support, just send me an email and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And I want to apologize again for starting the webinar a little bit late today. I was having some issues with Zoom. But please take care of yourselves. And I'll even encourage you to get up out of the room that you're in right now. Just take a gentle walk to process everything that you've just learned. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye.